Hey guys, in this lecture we're going to talk about what to expect from the data collection process and just some nuances. I know in the previous video we talked about SurveyMonkey itself and what's associated with that, but I want to kind of talk about some of the things that you might not expect from data collection and just some things to be aware of as you go to plan for it. I imagine for many of you this is the first time you've actually collected your own data for a piece of research. So just some insights to put out there. Let me talk first about qualitative research. If you're doing qualitative research, a lot of this is going to look very different for you. You can still use SurveyMonkey. That's perfectly all right, especially if you're doing like a qualitative free response sort of questions, right? Perfectly okay. You can actually gather the data this way and then analyze it however you want to externally. One of the things to consider too is how many participants you expect to get, who you expect to get. The data collection process for qualitative looks very different, and there's actually another lecture that we'll discuss that separately. This one I want to focus a little bit more on quant, just because that's more in line with what SurveyMonkey does. I've got the question summaries here open. We touched on that briefly in the previous video, but there's just a few things that I want to highlight in terms of what you can expect. So I would expect a lot of data collection to take place over the course of, say, 2 to 3 weeks. I would budget this, for example, when you're considering your timeline, when to present, when to defend, things like this. Budget 2 to 3 weeks for data collection, depending on your sample. So if you're sampling undergraduate college students at HCU, for example, it's very likely that you could probably get a good sample of 100 to 200 students in a matter of a week and a half or 2 weeks. Actually, my record for a study was about 3 days. So it can be a very short amount of time, but I would say always err on the side of caution. I would budget 2 to 3 weeks for data collection, particularly go smaller when the collection is more accessible, when it's a convenient sample, for example. When it's a sample that is going to be harder to obtain, a lot of my students go for sampling teachers, for example. And getting that kind of sample actually takes a lot longer. Many teachers are very reticent to share their opinions about things, and honestly, when do teachers have time? They are already overwhelmed with all the tasks that they're expected to do already. So with something like that, if you're trying to get a sample from a group of, say, teachers or therapists or other groups, always budget more time for the data collection. If you can actually line up a good sample ahead of time, that's going to be a big win, because getting people to participate is a big deal. The second point I want to make too is one of the things you might want to consider is incentivizing your study. And this is perfectly ethical too. Make sure you include it in your IRB application, but you can incentivize. So for example, in my studies, I offer 5 bonus points for students to participate, right? Regardless of what they say. I don't even know what they say, actually. Their data, or their identifiable data, and their answers to my study go in separate directions, so I can't even pair them up. Right? So I offer them 5 bonus points, which is nothing, because the class, overall my class is worth 1,000 points. So 5 points out of 1,000 is minimal, but it's a good inducement to get them to participate. Some studies, for example, offer, say, a $50 or $100 Amazon gift card by drawing, right, from a drawing. So if for every participant that participates in the study and wants to be involved, you can actually draw a Amazon gift card or a Target gift card or whatever like this. So a lot of people will participate just for the chance of winning something, right? That's a good incentive as well. But you want to keep that in mind, because it will increase the rate of response, so the number of people that do participate, it will increase the level of response, which is the number of people that participate. It will also increase the rate of response, which is how quickly they participate. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go to budget time. And money, in this case, if you're going to provide the gift card, that's just something to consider. Something that many people don't think about when they go to look at their data, right? So, for example, this is the first question the participants see, and this is whether or not they consent to be part of the study, right? So, in this question, it's a do or do not consent. And as I said before in the previous lecture, we had 147 that did and 4 that did not, right? So, already, the maximum participants we can have for the study is 147, right? We know that already. The second question they face is, are they done reading the article? This doesn't require an answer. It's just more to make sure that they've actually done so. It's a kind of a compliance check, but it's not important, right? And there are 4 of these, depending on the condition that the people participated in, right? And then if we look at these, right, so you'll notice of the 147 that were eligible to participate in the study, that acknowledged they consented, only 115 answered this question. right? So already we've scrubbed 32 participants off of the eligible participants that consented to be in the study, right? And if we follow this number down, so 115, 115, and we can keep looking across this, we might see this number drop. So 115 for this question. As we move to the study, 115 still here, right? And then 115. So what we're seeing is that our rate dropped to 115 initially, but was consistent through the rest of the study, right? So we'll go to the very last question here. Where is it? Blah, 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 blah. 115, 115, race and ethnicity. There we go. So 115 was where we hit with the very last content question, right? So what I want you to be aware of is, as I said, the number of 151 participants is just the people that clicked on the link. It is not the people that will actually complete your survey. So we went from 151 down to 115. So we scrubbed out, what, 36, as it indicates right there. 36 participants did not complete the study, even though they clicked the link. And to be very honest, this is a piece of research of my own, and it's a little polarizing. This is actually asking questions about violent crime, mass shootings, gun control. Actually, some of the questions you might have seen in the demographics ask questions about pornography. So I expect this from my studies, because whenever you ask questions that are polarizing or kind of personal or sensitive subjects, you can expect this. So I want you to keep this in mind. The term for this, by the way, is attrition. 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 I'd love to see that, by the way, in your thesis. It's a really good research term, and you should always be aware of it, right? So in this case, we went from 151 to 115. That's a pretty substantial attrition rate. And if I was writing this up for a thesis, I would discuss how the attrition rate is arguably attributable to the fact that the questions are very personal and polarizing, and in some cases kind of triggering, right? I mean, at this point, because it is so frequent, a lot of people don't want to talk about mass shootings. They don't want to talk about violent crime because they see enough of it in the news. In my thesis, if I was writing a thesis on this, I would discuss that and say this is a much higher attrition rate than we anticipated from the study. And you might be thinking, okay, so what can I expect from an attrition rate? With a study that's not too sensitive, where you're not asking particularly polarizing questions, I would expect an attrition rate of, say, maybe 10 to 15% of your participants, which obviously we went quite a bit higher on this one. However, the longer your questionnaire, the longer the instrument, the higher the attrition rate tends to be, because people will get bored and tired and click away and things like that. So kind of keep that in mind, all right? So what I would suggest with this too is, if you think, man, I really absolutely have to have 200 people to participate in my study, aim for 250. In this case, what you're doing is you're building in a 20% buffer for attrition. So if 250 people start the study, you could expect that 200 or more should probably finish it based on a 20% attrition rate. All right, just kind of keep that in mind as you go through the data collection. The other thing that I would like to point out before we move on to the lecture about data analysis is I would really suggest having an idea of what you expect to see. Right? So when I look at my questions, right, and let me go back up this way for these the questions I was discussing. Right? So here. So for example, the different bars represent strongly disagree all the way up to strongly agree, right, from top to bottom. What I was expecting, right, and this is about gun control, or rather mass shootings, right? And the question was, or the statement was, nothing could have prevented this event, right? I expect most people to disagree with that, and as you look at the results, 40%, more than 40%, strongly disagreed, and then another 33% or so disagreed, right? So we're looking at a minority of people who actually agree with that statement. This was something that I anticipated based on my hypotheses, but all I have to do is just look at the summary data to see that my hypothesis was in fact confirmed, right? So it's always good to start with a simplistic perspective, like summary data, rather than jumping right into SPSS or rather than jumping right into content analysis for qualitative research. Have a look at the summary data and see what it says in particular with regard to what you expected to happen. And what I want to point out, one last thing as I go to close this, if you see something you did not intend, it's not a bad thing, right? I think many people have this perception that, oh, well, if my hypothesis was wrong, I don't get my degree, or it was a bad thesis. Absolutely not. When you see something that happened that you didn't expect, write it down. Put down a bullet point, note it somehow, because that's going to make excellent content for your chapters 4 and 5 of your thesis. So just because it wasn't something you expected doesn't mean it's something that's bad and should be ignored. Make note of it, because you'd be amazed at how much content, good content, of a thesis is found in things that you didn't expect.